So, finally, after many weeks of me telling you, don't reveal anything. There's going to be something, there's going to be twists, there's going to be turns, there's going to be changes that are coming up. Well, we have our first major event, major twist, major turn in the plot in today's reading. Of course, there are more things to come, more things to be revealed. So if you have read the book before, or you've seen the movie, or you know more that's coming up, again, please don't reveal those further details. But now we do know one of the major parts of the plot that falls into place in chapter 13 of today's reading. Okay. So today, of course, as I said, we've continued our look at atonement with chapters 12 and 13, right? And again, we see McEwen is continuing this strategy of switching between different perspectives. Chapter 12, told from whose perspective? Emily, right? Emily's perspective. And then chapter 13, mostly Bryony again, right? So these shifts continue in this part of the novel. When we change chapters, we tend to change the perspective of the character. Good. All right. So we're almost halfway through this book, almost halfway through this novel, and we've seen this is like the first sort of big turning point in the novel, the thing that sort of McEwen has been building up to. And this is often actually quite a common feature of Ian McEwan's fiction, of his novels, right? Is they often tend to have some sort of big, either disastrous or tragic or impressive event that the characters have to react to in some sort of way. In this case, in Atonement, it occurs close to the middle of the book, as we're seeing, right? Chapter 13. And this is not always the way in his books. For example, the book he published, the novel he published before this one, Atonement, famously begins with a hot air balloon. And the hot air balloon has a young child in it, and it gets the people lose control of the hot air balloon, and the little child is caught in the hot air balloon and it floats away, and these guys have to try and pull it down, right? And the consequences of that moment, right, at the very beginning of the story, when we don't know about the characters, we don't know who they are, we don't know anything about their life situation or their background, right? We're just sort of thrown into this scenario of, wait a minute, there's a child and it's in a hot air balloon and we have to rescue it, right? And then we see the consequences work out in the rest of the novel. In this case, by contrast, we've seen this slow build-up of tension, right? Where we've seen inside the minds of the characters, we've learned particularly about Bryony and Cecilia and Robbie, right? We've seen what kinds of people they are. We've seen what stage they are at in their life, right? We've seen that their ages are quite important for how they see the world and how they react in this particular time. We've also talked about the context, right, of this story being set in summer of 1935 and how this affects things like the background, the historical background of it being set just before World War II, of the way in which this changes the relative positions of how we see the roles of men and women, of gender in this time, and all sorts of contexts like that. But of course, this is going to be, this moment, the accusation of Robbie by Bryony, as we can see, is marked, and I'm sure that this is something you all noticed in your homework sheets, is a big turning point in the narrative. Notice too, as well, that for our story so far has all taken place, as we took note of last time, in the course of one day, right? One day. So we began with the morning of the trials of Arabella, worked through the afternoon into the evening, and now it's nighttime, right? And we see that this day, this crucial day, is drawing to a close. And I talked to you about how this strategy of using one day in the life of a character or the life of several characters is a strategy that Ian McEwan, in this part, borrows from famous early 20th century modernist writers, right? So James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, right? Those novelists all wrote famous works that showed us the whole, sort of gave us a glimpse of the whole life of one character in just one day of their life, right? Okay, so even though this is one of the novel's big turning points, even though this is one of the things that creates a lot of the drama in Atonement, there's a specific reason why McEwan doesn't just like throw us straight into this moment, right? These early chapters that we've seen, right, in which we've gained not only knowledge about the characters and their contexts, but we've gained a lot of clues as to the kinds of ideas that McEwan is wanting us to explore in this novel, right? So these chapters, these early chapters are not just there so that you can, all right, I have to get through this, all right, fine, come on, hurry up, get to the point. Rather, they are there to provide us with ideas, clues as to how to read the bigger themes and ideas of the novel, right? So they are just as crucial as these sort of big turning point events. All right. So the first thing I want to look at today, and I'm going to focus because I know that, I imagine anyway, that most of you focused your attention on chapter 13 and upon Bryony and upon the events by the temple and those moments there with the attack upon Lola. So I'm going to focus a bit more of my attention in my lecture today upon chapter 12, which remember is from the perspective of Emily, right? Emily Tallis. And we have seen her perspective before, right? Remember this was in chapter 6, in which, remember that was the chapter in which Emily is lying in bed. She has a migraine, as usual, and in a very Virginia Woolf sort of style, she allows her mind to just wander about her thoughts, about her memories, and also she listens to all the sounds coming through the house, right? And from those sounds, she interprets what she thinks is happening, and she has this feeling like she is in charge of her sort of her household and her family through those noises. We also saw, of course, that she was sometimes quite wrong about what she thought was happening, right? That she has her own prejudices and her own assumptions, and also we saw that she is very old-fashioned, very conservative, in a way that really was quite normal for Emily's time, right? She represents, your sort of the view of the average English woman, upper middle class English woman at this time, which is to say she is certainly not a feminist. She is not someone who agrees with Cecilia's, going to university and her sort of association with some of the beginning sort of feminism movements around this time. And remember, in chapter 6, she was very critical of Cecilia for doing that, right? She's like, why did she go to Cambridge? She didn't even come back with a husband. And she's not going to get a job. What was the point, right? She's got to settle down at some point, get married, have a family, and live her life like a normal woman, according to the standards of 1935. In this chapter 12, we get some quite important symbolism. And a few years ago, I published a journal article on this book, and I used a section of this particular quote as the title because I thought it's particularly important, this symbolism of the moths, right? And this is, as Emily is thinking about all of these different things, again, we see into her different relationships with people. I'll talk about her sister Hermione in a moment. She's thinking about her marriage to Jack and how she thinks maybe her husband is having an affair, right? Something we find out much later, and it turns out to be much different to what we think has happened in their marriage. And also thinking about Bryony, she starts to think about this dinner party that she went to, that she attended previously, and in which she had a conversation with someone who studied moths, and he tells her about their behavior. Right, this is on page 80, I think. Yeah, 80 to 81. Right. So on page 80, it tells us, 2 or 3 stout-bodied moths circled the lamp that stood upon the harpsichord. When would anyone ever play it again? That night, creatures were drawn to lights where they could be most easily eaten by other creatures. That night, creatures were drawn to lights where they could be most easily eaten by other creatures was one of those mysteries they gave her modest pleasure. She preferred not to have it explained away. Right? So here we have, she sees these moths, and then in a very Virginia Woolf association kind of style, this triggers a train of thought in which she goes off and has other memories and other thoughts related to this. At a formal dinner once, a professor of some science or other, wanting to make small talk, make conversation, that means, had pointed out a few insects gyrating above a candelabra. He had told her that it was the visual impression of an even deeper darkness beyond the light that drew them in, right? Even though they might be eaten, they had to obey the instinct that made them seek out the darkest place on the far side of the light. And in this case, it was an illusion. It sounded to her like sophistry, right? Sophistry means like a clever explanation that's not real, right? That's just fake, made up. It sounds clever, but it doesn't really mean anything. Or an explanation for its own sake. How could anyone presume to know the world through the eyes of an insect? Not everything had a cause, and pretending otherwise was an interference in the workings of the world that was futile and could even lead to grief. Some things were simply so. All right? So you can see here, this moth and the need of a moth to fly towards a light or towards a flame is being used here by McEwen as a symbol, right? Now, remember, the scientist that she speaks to at that dinner, he says that when the moth sees the flame, his explanation is not that the moth wants to fly into the flame and be hurt, but rather that they have an optical or visual illusion, right? It looks like it's darker back here, right? So the moth wants to fly into this darkness that it perceives on the other side of the flame. What happens when it gets to the other side? It says, wait a minute, no, it looks darker over there, right? And then it flies to the other side. And then it says, no, wait, I'm wrong. It must be darker. And so its instincts keep on tricking it into believing that the other side of the flame is the darkness where it can hide, right? So it endlessly goes around the flame, right? Being tricked by this illusion that there is something there, that there's some darkness there that it can hide in. But in fact, there actually never is an actual darkness, right? So I want you to think about this bit of symbolism, especially when we come to discuss Bryony's accusation, right? Because remember, Bryony, she is there in the darkness, and she has this impression that she sees something, right? She's sure that she sees something. But whether she actually really does see what she believes that she sees at first, or that she wants to believe that she sees, is another question, right? So this moth symbolism, this metaphor that McEwen sets up for us, is quite an important one, right? It tells us that, well, this moth can be tricked into believing it sees something that's not really there. So too, we human beings can sometimes do the same thing. We can sometimes have this illusion that something is darker, nastier, deeper, more brutish, that may be there, but actually also might not be there, right? That there might not really be a conspiracy. There may not really be what we think is going on, all right? So that's one bit of symbolism. A second thing that I wanted to highlight today was the relationship between Emily and her sister Hermione. Right. Now, remember, this is the problems in Hermione's marriage are the events that caused the Quincy children, Lola and the two twins, Jackson and Piero, to be at the Tallis house in the first place, right? So they're there because Hermione, the sister, Emily's sister, and Bryony and Cecilia and Leon's aunt, has run off, left her marriage, run off with someone, and is often in Paris with her lover, having fun. And in the process, of course, her husband is divorcing her, and her children have been dumped upon the Tallises, right? Now, before, we had only seen a very small glimpse into this particular situation. And it was mostly seen from the perspective of the children, right? So we saw, for example, that the twins are wanting to go home earlier in the story. And then they realize, wait a minute, we can't go home, right? Our parents have broken up. And they're getting divorced, and there's no home for us anymore. We don't belong anywhere. And they start to feel this sense of loss and of also loss of authority, loss of someone to tell them what to do. So we have that bit of context. We also are told by Paul Marshall. Remember, Lola says, "Have you heard of my parents?" And he says, "Oh yes, I read about them in the papers." Right? Now, that might sound strange to us, but personal scandals and so on back in this time were something that people actually would write about and publish about in the newspapers, right? So you could be publicly disgraced by gossip in the newspapers that Hermione, daughter of the sister-in-law of famous. Or a high-ranking official in the British government has run off to Paris with her lover, right? And these are sort of like the scandal tabloid newspapers, right, in which these stories, this gossip is being spread, right? So this is a very sort of public disgrace that's occurring for the De Quincey family. And we see that this is not exactly the first time that Hermione has created problems in her life. In fact, we see through Emily's eyes that all her life she's been an attention seeker. She's been someone who wants the spotlight on her, who has been looking to, it's always selfishly wants the attention for herself, right? So we see that Emily in particular focuses on a childhood incident, right? Where, Emily is in serious, pain and agony and in danger really for her life. And this moment when everyone should be focusing upon Emily and worrying about her health and worrying about whether she'll live, at that moment, her sister Hermione decides to, have a panic attack. And instead of focusing upon Emily and upon whether she's going to die or whether she's going to survive this huge cut that she's got from running into a glass, everyone focuses instead upon her sister. Right? So let's look at this passage. Right, so she says, Hermione had lisped, right? So lisping is normally is a speech impediment. So if you lisp, for example, some people who lisp in English can't say the letter S properly. So they say it as a first sound, for example, so to lisp, right? But sometimes, especially in sort of like young children who are still developing their speech, it's often seen as something that could be cute as well, right? And usually they outgrow it and they speak normally when they get older. So, but in this case, when she's a child, Hermione had lisped and pranced and pirouetted through their childhoods, right? In other words, she's done all these things to gain the attention of her parents and of her family and everyone around her constantly. She's always drawing attention to herself. Showing off at every available moment with no thought. So her scowling, silent older sister believed, right? So this tells us that this account may be biased, right? That this attention-seeking in Hermione may just be the perception of a jealous older sister. For how ludicrous and desperate she appeared. There were always adults available to encourage this relentless preening. Right? Preening is something, like birds, parrots do and so on, and to make their feathers look good. And so it's being applied to like this young girl who's always trying to make herself look good. And when famously the 11-year-old Emily had shocked a room full of visitors by running into a French window and cutting her hand so badly that a spray of blood had made a scarlet bouquet on the white muslin dress of a nearby child, it was the 9-year-old Hermione who took center stage with a screaming attack. Right? So here's Emily. She's cut her hand open by running into a glass, sort of spray of blood all over another girl's dress. Right? And instead of the attention being focused upon her hand and upon her, everyone is focused on Hermione. Oh, she's having a screaming attack. Right? This is the subjective way in which Emily remembers this event. While Emily lay in obscurity on the floor, in the shadow of a sofa, with a medical uncle applying an expert tourniquet, a dozen relatives worked to calm her sister. And now she was in Paris, frolicking with a man who worked in the wireless. Remember, that means the radio, while Emily cared for her children. Right? So, for Emily, this is a pattern of behavior that she's seen in her sister over and over again. Right? Her sister is selfish, attention-seeking, right? She just only cares about herself and her own pleasures and how she looks and how she feels. And this has gone from childhood to the event with the cutting her hand, all the way through to even now with her, now that she's grown up and she's run off from her marriage, and it's like, oh yeah, Emily can look after my kids, right? Emily can take care of that problem. Now again, remember, even though this part is written in third person, right? Notice we're not told that this is Emily saying, I remember this or I did that. Nonetheless, the implicit perspective is from Emily, right? So we're seeing this, even though it's third person, through the perspective, through the eyes, through the memory, through the feelings of Emily. So even though it's third person, it still comes across to us as colored by her own bias. It's quite possible that not only that she may have some insights into Hermione's character, but it's also quite possible she's just also jealous of her sister, right? Especially because we know that from her feelings that she reveals about her marriage, she feels kind of neglected by her husband, doesn't she? Right? She feels like he's always off working, always off in London, and sort of ignoring her and not paying enough attention to her, to the point where she starts to suspect, is this guy having an affair? Is he seeing someone else? All right. Then the really interesting part for us, especially for what happens in the next chapter, but also for what we've seen in two previous moments in the story, right, is how Emily compares Lola to her mother Hermione, right? Because we've seen at a couple of different times where Lola, on the one hand, she has been attention-seeking, hasn't she? Right? She has tried to impress other people. She's tried to make the focus all about her, right? So she wants to be the star of the play. She wants to show off to Paul Marshall about how she went to Hamlet when she really saw the pantomime, right? All of these things where she's tried to be sort of more impressive than she really is, to act like she's this advanced adult, right? Is one aspect of this. But also more seriously, we've seen that there have been moments where we suspect, especially when it comes to the attack that she claims was done by the twins when she was in the bath, right, where she has the bruises on her arm, right, and she's really like bruised up. She's not just like a couple of little things done by a kid, but really has some serious marks on her. That in those moments we suspect, well, is she lying, right? Is it really the twins that attacked her, or was it someone else, right, in those moments? And of course, to this point, she's lied both those times. When Bryony talks to her about it, she claims it was the twins. When Emily talks to Lola about it, oh yeah, definitely the twins. How could the twins do this? I don't know, they just did, right? Is what she says in our reading last time. So here we have Emily now goes from thinking about her sister to thinking, applying those same prejudice, same biases to her niece in Lola, right? And saying, this Lola, she acts all innocent, but she's exactly like my sister, Hermione. She's exactly like her. Right? So here's what she says. And Lola, like her mother, would not be held back. As soon as the letter was read, she upstaged her runaway brothers with her own dramatic exit. Right? So remember the scene with that we just mentioned with the cut hand and Hermione having to take the attention away? She's saying Lola's done the same thing. So the twins run off, and so Lola does the same thing. Tries to upstage them, tries to make the focus all about her. Right? Remember, this is Emily's biased point of view. Earlier, Lola had been distressed and said, oh, Mummy's going to kill me for this. So here she's referring back to that. Mummy will kill me indeed. But it was Mummy, that is Hermione, whose spirit she was keeping alive. When the twins came back, it was a certain bet that Lola would still have to be found. Bound by an iron principle of self-love, in other words, she's selfish, she would stay out longer in the darkness, wrapping herself in some fabricated, made-up misfortune, so that the general relief when she appeared would be all the more intense and all the attention would be hers. That afternoon, without stirring from her daybed, Emily had guessed that Lola was undermining Bryony's play, a suspicion confirmed by the diagonally ripped poster on the easel. And just as she predicted, Bryony had been outside somewhere, sulking and impossible to find. How like Hermione Lola was, to remain guiltless while others destroyed themselves at her prompting. Now McEwan, again, he gives us more clues that even though we're being given some insights here, even though we're being given some particular views about these characters, that we shouldn't take them completely at face value here, right? We shouldn't accept them absolutely. Because notice that, like in chapter 6, Emily gets certain things wrong. She gets certain facts incorrect, even though she does work out some things for herself. We see she gets certain facts correct. What was incorrect about that last part? Who ripped the poster? Bryony was the one who ripped down the poster, right? Remember, this is when she goes off to slash the nettles, right? And she gets mad and she decides fine, I'm not going to put on the play at all, right? The twins aren't cooperating, Lola's not cooperating, fine, I'm not going to put on a play. And then she rips down the poster, and she goes off and she slashes the nettles, and she, ends up, with the letter and so on. Who does Emily think tore down the poster? Lola, in this case, right? So we can see here that even though McEwan is using Emily's perspective to give us some insight into these characters and to give us another way of looking at them, as always, perspective has its own bias. It has its own prejudices. And we can see that we can't entirely trust what Emily has to say here. Why? Because she's clearly prejudiced in various ways. Her prejudice, her jealousy of her sister, whether it's deserved or not, makes her in turn jealous of Lola. And so she, of course, is protective of her own daughter. Right? She doesn't see the naughtiness or anything of what her own daughter has done. She's like, oh, my little Bryony, my baby, right? She's just trying to put on a play, and that mean Lola came along and was just jealous and undermined it and tore down the poster, right? Not true, not entirely true, right? It's not the whole picture of what happened. So these things, as I said, as we've been building up to chapter 13, right, these little clues as to how we look at this question of perspective, right, that there is always something suspect, there's always something subjective, there's something prejudiced and biased about the nature of perspective. That even as we gain insight from Emily, we also have to take what she says, as they say, with a grain of salt. We can't believe it 100%, because built into it are these elements of bias that make us suspect, maybe her account is prejudiced because of her past, because of her relationship with her sister and so on. Okay. Okay. Now, I've mentioned this before, and I'm not going to go into detail, because I'm sure that some of you also focused upon this in your homework sheets. But I do want, once again, to impress upon you the importance of this light as an important symbol in the story. And you can particularly see it, I'm sure you noticed, the way in which McEwan uses this in the scene where Bryony comes across Lola at the temple, right? And what she sees there and how it's described, all of that is very strongly dependent upon the metaphor of light. But notice too that the way in which the moth symbolism that I mentioned a moment ago also complicates any sort of easy black and white division or easy separate division between, light and dark, knowledge, ignorance, guilt, and innocence, right? Any of those sorts of things are very complex, right? Especially because, as we saw with the moth symbolism, it's possible to think that we see something bad, or to believe that there is some kind of evil deed being done, or to believe that someone is a monster, or to believe that there is some sort of conspiracy, when in fact there may not be, right? You don't fully have evidence of these things. And so the moth symbolism alerts us to this, right? It gives us a clue to not fully trust what people say that they saw, or say that they believe that they saw, in particular, of course, Bryony, right? So this light symbolism, very important. Just to tease this out a little more. Also, pay very close attention to the language that McEwan uses with regards to, first of all, the light, but also notice the uncertain language that particularly Lola uses, right? So when Bryony, asks her, it was him, wasn't it? Or things like that. Well, who is him? Does it mean Paul Marshall? Does it mean Danny Hardman? Does it mean Robbie? Does it, who? Right? And it's never properly confirmed for us, right? And remember, this is the same strategy that Lola used earlier on, right? Is that she was always very vague about what had happened, or she left things out, or she pretended to be innocent. And I don't know. Well, I don't know how the twins did that, right? So there is, the actual dialogue and the language that is spoken between these two characters in that moment, in that exchange, right? Pay very careful attention to how the characters speak to each other, because Lola, right, she doesn't actually confirm anything. She makes no positive affirmation. She doesn't say, oh yes, I was attacked by this person, or this is what happened to me, right? Instead, she gives extremely ambiguous, uncertain answers, right? In a way that allows what happens with Bryony to occur, is that Bryony then steps in and says, well, okay, all right, well then I know what must have happened, and then she steps into her conclusion, right? And she provides an explanation, she provides a conclusion where Lola refuses to give any sort of certainty, right? And instead, Lola just keeps on saying, you saw what happened. Why should I tell you? You saw it, right? So you tell me what you saw. You tell me what happened, right? So very carefully worded, very carefully described scene here. And so when we're analyzing it, we have to pay close attention to the way in which these two characters speak to each other. And then in turn, when Bryony is questioned, right, they question her also very carefully. And the way in which she provides her answers is also important. So Bryony, similarly, we've seen already that she has this sort of storytelling instinct. And remember, she constantly is looking to try and think about life and how she can fit it into her stories, right? So she says, well, this is perfect, right? If I was to write a story, right, clearly the fountain scene would be the setup, right? The evil guy, Robbie, blackmails the sister. Then he attacks her in the library. And now at the temple, it's the final climax scene of my story, right? So all these things must have foretold, they must have led up to Robbie being the evil one who attacked Lola, right? That's her storytelling mind at work, right? This is the way she thinks about it. Is it like, well, clearly if this was a story, then it has to be Robbie, because I've cast him as the villain, right? Why would it be someone else? That would be crazy. Why would you build up a villain and then not use him at the moment of the greatest evil attack? So in her mind, she's thinking, well, Robbie, I've set him up as the villain. He must be the attacker. However, you can see that in her mind and in the way in which the other people, particularly the policemen, right, when they come to question her, right, she tries to express that it's a bit more complicated than that. It's not that I actually saw Robbie, right? I didn't see him, but I know it was him, right? But I didn't see him, but I saw him, right? You know what I mean? And so this is the difficulty, she says, that she has trying to express that difference, right? Is that she's yeah, but I know it was him, right? I'm sure I saw it. I didn't see him, but I believe that I saw him, I know it was him. Come on, we know it was him. Right? It's the way in which she puts it. And of course, this makes us extremely suspicious about what she actually saw, what she actually literally saw, especially because Lola, even like when Lola says, well, you tell me what you saw, Lola's sort of like, really? That's what you saw? Okay. You know? And even Lola doesn't seem to really believe what Bryony says. Okay.
I have a question.
Yep.
If Lola really doesn't know who it was.
Well, we don't know. I'm pretty sure that, and you can decide when we get towards the end of the novel whether she does know, because we come back around to who it might be at the end. But you'll have to decide, I think, for yourself. Because it's just like with the bath, right? Was it really the twins that attacked her? Well, I'm very skeptical, but the novel, we can only go on what the novel tells us, like, absolutely. So we can speculate, well, it seemed to me that she's lying, but I don't know 100%, right? So the way in which the novel frames the attack is the same way, right? Is that, you know, we're almost sure that, like, Bryony is lying, but it's left ambiguous. We're almost sure that Lola knows who it was, but it's left uncertain, right? So it's always one of those things when we're reading a literary text. Remember, I said it's a bit like looking for clues. It's like detective work. You've got to try and work out, you know, what really happened and what the author is trying to get us to think about. But at the same time, we can only go with what knowledge and information the text provides us with, right? We can't say, oh yeah, well, I know what happened even though McEwan doesn't tell me, right? Okay. Lastly, in relation to this scene, and I mentioned this before in class, I came back to this particular scene in chapter 8, which was the scene where Robbie comes across Bryony standing in the twilight, and he gives her the letter, right? I particularly want you to think about that scene in relation to Bryony's discovery of Lola. Because remember in that scene, it's like, it's not quite dark yet, right? Like the light has been fading, but it's still kind of twilight. Right? It's still murky, but it's still a little bit of light left from the sunset when Robbie comes across Bryony. And remember when he's about, let's imagine if Bryony's at the back of the room that far away, he's sort of like, what is that like a stone? What is that? And then he gets a bit closer, and, oh, it looks like a human. And then he gets closer still, he's like, oh, it's a child. Oh, it's Bryony, right? And it takes him until he's very close to Bryony in that darkness to be able to actually see that it's her, right? So in that moment, right, we see the difficulty of identifying and seeing who someone is even when there is like just a little bit of twilight left. Whereas compare that when Bryony is in the pitch black of night, she's in the temple, right? Now we know that there's no roof left on this temple, right? Because it's all ruined. But she's in the temple, it's pitch black, and remember, we're told that only the adults have torches, right? They're the only ones that have flashlights to be able to see what's going on. So there's a big difference there. Robbie is like, is that Bryony? Really? I can't quite make her out in the twilight. And yet in the darkness, Bryony said, oh, I know who that is. Yeah, I know who that must be, right? And what she bases that on is what we have to question. All right. So let's turn now to our homework sheets. And as I said, I'm sure most of you focused your attention upon chapter 13, which is why I focus more on chapter 12, to see some of the ways in which McEwan is leading us into the strategies that we need to understand and approach this central event in the story. Okay, We are out of time. Thank you guys. Please hand in your prep sheets, and I'll see you on Thursday.